One local city is working on laws to protect its large immigrant population. What type of laws is it enacting? Find out on Talking with Henrietta, coming up next. Hi, I'm Henrietta. Welcome to the show. The city of East Palo Alto describes itself as a multi-ethnic community composed of diverse peoples from all over the world. Over the past 10 years, the city has adopted 3 separate resolutions to address the issue of immigrant reform. The city has a large Latino population, and many of its residents have become concerned and even frightened by President Trump's efforts to tighten this country's immigration policies and increase the government's deportation of undocumented residents. On this show, I will talk with 2 representatives from the city of East Palo Alto. Rafael Alvarado Jr., the attorney for the city of East Palo Alto, is seated on my left. Mr. Alvarado was appointed to his current position with the city in June of 2016. Prior to becoming East Palo Alto city attorney, he served 10 years as assistant city attorney for the city of Hayward. He got his law degree from the Santa Clara University School of Law and once served as a summer intern for the city of East Palo Alto. Vice Mayor Ruben Abrica is seated on my right. Mr. Abrica served on the city's very first council in 1983 when East Palo Alto was incorporated as a city. Since that time, he has served as mayor of the city for at least 3 times. He teaches at De Anza College, where he holds a joint appointment in Spanish and Latino Studies Department. Vice Mayor Abrica was born in Jalisco, Mexico. He grew up in Tijuana and immigrated to California as a teenager. Well, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for the invitation.
Yes, to talk on the subject of immigration and what the city of East Palo Alto is doing. Now, I mentioned that you were born, Vice Mayor Abrica, in Jalisco. Were you born in the United States?
We were having a discussion offset, and I did state that I actually am an immigrant myself. I was born in Nicaragua, and my family came here in the 80s, like a lot of families from Nicaragua, and moved to San Francisco. So I've been in the Bay Area ever since.
So this is something personal that the 2 of you can relate to.
Yes, you know, for me, growing up, especially along the border, in San Diego, Tijuana area, where you saw a lot of people going back and forth to work, to shop, and having in my family also people who had worked in the fields, who worked doing housekeeping jobs. My mom did that. And for a while, some of them also didn't have documents. So I was keenly aware of what it's like to be in that situation. I myself, as a 6-year-old, once was detained by immigration in San Diego. And I'll never forget being in a detention center for a day, being interrogated as a 6-year-old.
Where were your parents or guardians?
Well, my mom worked in Del Mar, and she didn't have any papers. And my aunt and I used to cross the border from Tijuana to San Diego, which is less than an hour away, on Sunday afternoons, spend the time downtown, and then she would take a bus to go to work. And one particular Sunday, the immigration and the police showed up. They closed off the entire block and raided people and took kids too. So that's when I first learned what that feels like, what it's like. Luckily, I think my own family had trained me very well. You know, I lived in Mexico. We didn't have the Fifth Amendment, but basically, I didn't answer any questions. and didn't break down, luckily.
As a
As
six-year-old?
a 6-year-old, yes. My uncle always told me, don't you cry if you get stopped. Don't you say anything. You be a man. You know, it was a positive side of being a man. That you take it, you don't answer any questions. So that's,
And were you released to your aunt? Was she there, or?
yeah, well, eventually we were released, yes. After my mom's employer, who happened to be a very wealthy, influential people in San Diego, found out that she wasn't at work, and that helped a lot. But you know, that has stayed with me over the years, and so now that we're having this situation where it appears that the current administration is basically setting loose, you know, thousands of immigration agents to go after people, not necessarily following any categories like the Obama administration had at least done, to go after hardcore criminals, et cetera. This is like anybody without documents, it's now open game.
But people would say if they're not documented, they don't belong here. So how do you then defend the presence of people in this country who are here illegally?
Well, immigration enforcement happens at a federal level. It's truly the federal government's responsibility to enforce civil immigration laws. And here in East Palo Alto, the council has made the decision that it does not participate in federal civil immigration enforcement. And back in 2007, that's when the city began with its own process of what we refer to as its local immigration reform, setting forth policies that create a line between local law enforcement and the enforcement of local criminal laws, and separating that from the enforcement of just simply federal civil immigration law.
So wait a moment, there are people who would say federal law is federal law. And why shouldn't cities follow federal laws when it comes to immigration? Either one of you.
Well, you know, I would say the way, and I'm certainly not an expert on, legal issues, but I've served in local government enough to know that our system is a very decentralized system where the federal government has certain authorities, the states have other authorities that the federal government cannot take away, and the local governments have certain authorities too, which I suppose only in a state of war or something the federal government could impose it. But the truth of the matter is that when it comes, for example, to police, the police chief answers to the city manager, who in turn answers to the city council. They don't answer to the president of the United States. It is local people who pay their salaries. It is local people who elect representatives to adopt certain resolutions or laws. So we, back in 2007, actually, one of the resolutions, which is still in operation, is still valid, made it very clear that we did not want city staff, including police, to be acting as immigration agents.
Now, I am going to...
Now, there are some exceptions, I would say,
Sure,
not
sure.
a blanket thing, because obviously if a criminal is loose in the community, if there's some, high level of criminality and the police needs to get involved and the person gets arrested, well, then it becomes the sheriff, it goes into the criminal justice system, and at that point, the federal government does have more.
Okay, I'd like to get back to that a little bit more. But I find it very interesting that the cities are now talking about the powers that they have as cities, and the state its own independence and power. And there was a time, of course, during the civil rights movement that the states in the South were talking about states' rights and how they had the right not to follow the law when it came to integration. Mm-hmm. So how is it now, that people are saying, oh, well, we have states' rights. And at the time then, people complained about, denied that states should have those rights.
I hear that analogy, but the issue of immigration is really not analogous to issues that came up during the civil rights movement. This is a very basic foundational constitutional question about the separation of powers between the federal government and state governments. And the federal government has actually said we retain ourselves the power as the federal government to enforce federal civil immigration law. And they do not have, the federal government does not have the power to commandeer our local law enforcement and say, you must now enforce federal civil immigration law. There's already been case law that has established that. Now, local governments can partner with federal governments and sometimes do, but they do so on a voluntary basis. And here, our local policy is that we do not participate on a voluntary basis with respect to federal civil immigration enforcement.
Can the government send in the National Guard?
Wow, that's a very challenging question to answer.
Because Trump has talked about maybe the possibility of sending in the National Guard in Chicago.
You know, what is challenging for us as local governments right now is to truly know what the federal government is going to do going forward, and I think it's really early at this stage, and we're doing our best to gather information and to really anticipate what we could do locally. We really can't control what the federal government is going to do, but we certainly can have impact within our own communities, and that's what our council is choosing to do.
Now,
And in the case of Chicago, you know, he didn't say that about immigration. It was more about the crime, which, you know, that's another area. But he hasn't said that yet about immigration, and that certainly would create a clash of authorities.
Sure. Well, what
too.
I've heard is that there is this possibility. Now, of course, with the Trump administration, there are rumors that abound, and what's the truth? That there might be 15,000 new immigration officers. And of course, people are saying, well, you want to cut down on government bureaucracy
Yes,
and
now you
hiring
just-
15,000 immigration officers, but
Right.
that certainly would give more clout in terms of having raids and rounding up people.
Yes. Yeah, I agree. I think in that case, I think Congress still has to approve the money. My guess is that they probably will approve the money and forget all their promises about less government and all of that. That just seems to be the way that this administration and the majority in Congress is choosing to basically persecute people during this time in our history, just like it's happened at other times. You know, it's not necessarily anything new. Even as a person of Mexican descent, I can tell you that in the 1930s, from 1932 to 1936, this is a fact that often is not mentioned. It never shows up in the history books. Nobody really talks about it. But in our community, we know that there were close to 1 million people of Mexican descent and others were repatriated to Mexico right after the Depression. And about a third of them were U.S. citizens, children, young people, old people. So we know that it can happen. It's happening again. And I think the local response, as far as I'm concerned, is that in a place like East Palo Alto, which I think historically has been a place where, you know, people have come because often they weren't wanted somewhere else. This is true in the African American community, the Latino community. We have other immigrants who've come willingly, or, you know, and I think this is consistent with what I feel is a certain philosophy of our community, that we have to protect each other. We have to help each other in times of need, whether it's civil rights, whether it's human rights, whether in this case that the fact that there are 11 million people who, you know, they did arrive here without any documents, but 11 million people in the country are fully integrated in the economy. They pay taxes, they contribute. And so if we want to help our own communities, say in the issue of police, the easiest way to break the trust with immigrant communities is to have the police harassing people about their immigration status. And that's really all that this resolution does, is remind us that if in East Palo Alto we want to keep solving crimes, reducing crimes, improving the public safety, like, let's not target the immigrant community.
That was the first resolution in 2007.
First resolution, 2007. And at the time, you know, you might remember that there was a much more positive time where, actually I think it was Ted Kennedy and John McCain who had joined forces to propose a bill to the Senate, and it looked like it might pass and have a a new immigration reform. Well, after that, politics, became more difficult, and nothing happened.
And
But
that was later the election of President Obama.
that's Obama. But during that time in 2006, 2007, there were millions of people who came out in support of that. The vast majority were immigrant people. I went to a San Francisco rally. There must have been 100,000
Oh,
people. And I actually presented this resolution to the crowd. And people applauded, and they were happy. And I was proud that East Palo Alto had taken a stance to, assure people in our community that we were not going to persecute him through the police investigating or anybody else. And it's taken time, but I've seen the effects of people gradually building up trust with the police. It's not the only thing, but it is one thing that I've seen.
sure. Now, there are two other resolutions.
Correct.
What are they?
Well, I'm going to touch on the 2000 resolution as our starting point because that
The
really
2007.
Yes, and it's known as Resolution 2673. And it's really the primary resolution in the city of East Palo Alto, the mechanism by which the council has set forth a policy doing three main things. Number one is it asks for the Department of Homeland Security to stop its intimidation tactics within the city of East Palo Alto. And also called on ICE to stop displaying police on their uniforms. There was a concern that ICE agents and local police were being mistaken for one another, and the council wanted it to be clear that local police, local law enforcement engages in local criminal investigations and not civil federal immigration enforcement. So it called on ICE to stop displaying police on their uniforms. And it also directed the city manager to direct city staff not to act as agents of ICE, meaning not to act as individuals that would impose upon its community federal immigration enforcement. That's really the first resolution and the really guiding resolution. The other two resolutions that came about in 2010 and 2012 are really advisory resolutions to the county of San Mateo, asking for the county to do as East Palo Alto is doing and to protect their local immigrant communities. How would we encourage them to do that? We encourage them to also pass legislations or resolutions that would separate local criminal enforcement from federal civil immigration enforcement. And those are
So,
essentially the three resolutions we have today.
Let's go back, before we talk about the third resolution, let's go back to the first one, where the city made several requests of ICE.
Correct.
For example, not wearing the badge that has police on it.
Correct.
Did ICE respond to the
Not
request?
formally, and I believe that oftentimes they have uniforms that both identify them as a federal agent by having ICE on their uniform, but in some circumstances they still just demonstrate the label police. So despite our calls, they're not always followed.
Even in terms of the other requests within the resolution?
It's hard to track. What we do know is that since 2007 there was an uptick of deportations. Since that time we have observed that there has been an increase in deportations yearly, and some would characterize those deportations as violative of our own local policies. We can't control what the federal government can do. We can control what we do locally, and the purpose of that resolution was to ensure that our own local police is not participating in federal civil immigration enforcement.
And has the county responded to the city's request?
The county has updated their policies, both in terms of their local jail policies and local enforcement policies, and some of that has to do with updates in California law. Since 2007, the original resolution, we've had two state laws, the California Truth Act and the California Trust Act, that has imposed changes in terms of how local police and county jails really participate in their relationship with ICE and with other federal agencies. Now, East Palo Alto doesn't have a local jail, so those state laws don't really impact us as much as it impacts the county sheriff's office.
And you were going to talk about were you going to say
Oh, I was
something?
gonna
I'm
say
sorry.
that, yeah, or the third, or the secure communities. It's a immigration program that used to be in effect, particularly with counties, where they would even pay counties, or it would enter into a partnership with cities or counties. Say, we'll give you some monies if you work with us, ICE, So that was voluntary. And actually, the Obama administration, as I understand it, kind of suspended that or put it aside. But now the Trump administration is bringing it back. Now, certainly, I'm only speaking as one person, but if ICE called us, East Palo Alto, and say, you know, we'll give you some money so that your police department can work with us, we'll give you a contract, I certainly would be opposed to that. But
Well,
that is what may start happening, that in other cities and other counties, basically they can give money to, and at the time I think the council also expressed through that resolution advising the county saying, you know, like, don't participate in that.
sure. Now, I'm thinking there's also the other side of that. Rather than giving money, I've heard that the administration might say, we're going to take away money, that the cities and counties get get federal funds, and instead of funding you, we will penalize you. And I know that came up as an issue at the study session where one city council member said, well, we'll even consider not accepting the money if we can't enforce our policies with regard to our residents.
The executive order that was issued in late January does have language that indicates that sanctuary cities, specifically, if they have federal money or will request federal money, might be denied those federal monies. Now, there is a fight already happening with respect to that executive order. I know the city and county of San Francisco and the county of Santa Clara have filed lawsuits already challenging the executive order. And there's layers of legal argument that can be made in terms of the federal government's ability to do that. And it's really early to say how that's going to fall. What we do know is that in the city of East Palo Alto, we're not similarly situated to counties because we don't run county jails. And therefore, the arguments that the federal government is making in terms of the reasons why they can withhold money may not be applicable in East Palo Alto.
But as I recall, the city does get, in terms of federal grants,
yes,
that have supported the police department, for instance.
Yes.
So there is some leverage, or there had been leverage in the past.
Now, it comes down to a question of whether our local policies are violative of a particular section of the U.S. Code, the United States Code, and our position is that we don't violate that particular provision, and therefore our federal monies are not at issue. Now, that is our position, and again, it's still early on, and we are yet to see what will happen going forward. But we think that given our policies and what we know about the executive orders and federal law, that we're in an okay position.
Now, the third resolution, I don't think we talked about it.
Yes. The third resolution is, again, another advisory resolution where we asked the County of San Mateo not to comply with ICE enforcement on juveniles. We were hearing that ICE was detaining juveniles, and therefore our resolution essentially asked the County of San Mateo and the probation department not to detain juveniles simply on federal civil immigration detainers. Now, if there's a crime that was committed, there's nothing that we can do. Frankly, the city encourages our local law enforcement. We work very well with our own police department, obviously, and our county partners on the enforcement of local and state criminal law. But what we were concerned about as a city was ICE detaining juveniles on federal civil immigration matters.
And how do you define juvenile?
Anyone under the age of 18.
Oh, okay, because I was going to say 6 years old, that's a child. And I think of juveniles in terms of teenagers.
Yes.
But for you, it's anyone under 18 that would cover a 6-year-old.
Yes, it would.
Those were different times too where, well, San Diego was, let's just say it, to me, it was a conservative county, and they...
But in terms of what's...
those practices, you know, is not to, you know, point the finger at immigration officers who obviously are doing their job too. But we do know that in certain parts of the country or certain elements within them are sometimes particularly vicious, and they're inhumane.
In terms of what's going on now,
Yeah.
it doesn't seem to be that different. I mean,
Right.
it just so happens you were 6 years old,
Yes.
but the idea of even detaining a child under 18.
Right. Yeah. So that's why I think we are, I mean, more and more I think we are preparing for the worst, both at, and now I'm speaking both as a elected official, but just as a community member within our community, within our own community, different organizations, churches, etc., working to find, finding ways to protect each other, to help each other, to call on the authorities to help us, but not necessarily also rely only on the authorities, because sometimes the authorities themselves may be the ones that
Well, I
help
was just
ICE.
thinking,
So-
calling on the authorities to help you. These are the very same authorities,
Exactly.
yes, who are raiding and cracking down
Yeah.
on. Now, you mentioned the word harassment, and I think you mentioned the word persecution.
Yeah.
How do you explain to viewers, to Trump supporters, that going after undocumented residents is persecution and harassment?
Well, in our resolution from 2007, we used the word intimidation tactics, and I believe the context of the word and the usage of the word in that resolution has to do with unfettered immigration raids that were happening within our own community, and those are the tactics that we have concerns about, not only then in 2007, but frankly going forward.